Hannibal Barca's Alpine crossing in 218 BC ended the way an invasion was never supposed to end, with Rome still standing, and Carthage ultimately ruined. He dragged a multinational army over the Alps to strike the Roman Republic from a direction Roman doctrine treated as a wall, not a route. The shock worked. Rome panicked, scrambled, and bled in battles it did not expect to fight on its own soil. And yet the war did not end. So what was this, really? A strategic masterpiece, or a gamble that only looked inevitable after it survived? Why would a commander voluntarily enter Italy already half destroyed? And what does it mean when the most dangerous move in a war creates victories, but cannot manufacture an ending? This episode is not about how Hannibal crossed the Alps. That story is familiar, almost mythologized. This episode is about why that decision existed at all. By the time Hannibal marched into Italy, Carthage was not searching for tactical brilliance. It was searching for a way out of a structural trap. Rome had deeper manpower. Rome had political resilience. Rome could lose armies and continue the war. Carthage could not. The strategic problem was simple and brutal. How do you defeat a system that becomes stronger the longer a war lasts? Conventional answers failed that test. Attrition favored Rome. Incremental gains favored Rome. Defensive patience favored Rome. The Alpine crossing was unorthodox not because it was bold, but because it attempted to collapse the war at the psychological and political level before material superiority could assert itself. It was a strategy built on a narrow assumption that shock, speed, and humiliation could fracture Rome's alliances faster than Rome could adapt. If that assumption held, the war could end quickly. If it failed, Hannibal would be trapped deep in hostile territory with no strategic exit. And to understand why Hannibal accepted that risk, we first need to understand the battlefield he was actually fighting on, long before a single soldier touched the Alps. To understand why Hannibal's decision mattered, we have to discard the idea that this war was decided on battlefields alone. Before the Alps, before Italy, before the first Roman legion fell, the war was already asymmetrical, not in weapons, but in structure. Rome was not simply a city-state with armies. Rome was a system. It was a political machine that converted defeat into mobilization. It was a social contract that bound allies through obligation, fear, and reward. And it was a logistical organism capable of absorbing losses that would have ended most ancient states. Carthage, by contrast, was powerful but brittle. Its strength lay in money, trade, and hired force. Its weakness lay in cohesion, endurance, and political patience. This imbalance defined everything Hannibal could, and could not, do. Rome's objective was not subtle. It did not need to destroy Carthage in one stroke. It needed to outlast it. Roman strategy tolerated failure because Rome could regenerate. A defeated consul could be replaced. A destroyed army could be rebuilt. A lost province could be retaken later. Time worked for Rome. Carthage's objective was the opposite. It needed resolution. A decisive shift. A break in the system. And that difference alone made conventional warfare suicidal. The geography that lied. On paper, the Mediterranean offered obvious routes. Sea lanes connected Iberia, Gaul, Sicily, and Italy. Rivers cut through northern Italy into the Roman heartland. Mountain passes existed, but they were treated as barriers, not arteries. Roman planners did not ignore the Alps. They dismissed them. Not because they were impassable in theory, but because they were strategically irrelevant. An army emerging from the Alps would be exhausted, undersupplied, fragmented, and vulnerable. Such a force would not threaten Rome. It would invite annihilation. That assumption shaped Roman defense. Legions were positioned to guard expected axes of advance. Naval power secured the coasts. Diplomacy stabilized northern Italy. The Alps were not defended, because no serious enemy was expected to use them. This was not negligence. It was rational doctrine. And that doctrine created a blind zone. The logistics problem nobody solved. Ancient warfare was ruled by supply. Armies could not outrun their food. They moved along rivers, roads, and friendly populations. Rome understood this deeply. Its campaigns were designed around seasonal movement and secure provisioning. Roman armies advanced where Rome could feed them. Carthage had no equivalent depth in Italy. Once Hannibal left Iberia, he severed himself from stable supply lines. Every mile forward increased his dependence on local cooperation or coercion. That meant the campaign would live or die on assumptions about human behavior, not material planning. Would local tribes cooperate? Would Roman allies defect? Would fear outweigh loyalty? These were not logistical questions in the traditional sense. They were political bets. And every bet was irreversible. Time as an enemy. Rome's greatest advantage was not legions. It was patience. Roman political culture accepted prolonged sacrifice. Defeat did not delegitimize the system. It intensified it. Carthage had no such luxury. Its wars were expensive. Its armies were foreign. Its political elite was divided. A long war would erode support at home long before Rome felt existential strain. Hannibal knew this. Which meant any strategy that extended the war without transforming it was already lost. This is the first key constraint: Hannibal could not afford to fight a good war. He needed to fight a short one, or none at all. The alliance network, Rome's true center of gravity. Rome's power in Italy did not come from occupation. It came from integration. Allied cities supplied troops, food, and legitimacy. They fought not only out of fear, but because defection carried unbearable cost. Rome punished betrayal absolutely. But it also rewarded loyalty reliably. This created a system where most allies calculated that staying with Rome, even after Roman defeat, was safer than gambling on change. Hannibal's campaign targeted this network. Not directly with diplomacy at first, but with demonstration. If Rome could be humiliated repeatedly on its own soil, the logic binding the alliance might fracture. But here lay another constraint. Alliance systems do not collapse from one shock. They collapse when fear becomes persistent and alternatives appear viable. That required time. And time favored Rome. The internal Roman dilemma. Rome was not monolithic. Its Senate, its magistrates, its generals, and its public did not always agree. Military disaster created pressure, but also rigidity. Roman culture demanded response. Inaction was politically dangerous. This mattered. A shock from an unexpected direction would not just threaten Rome militarily. It would force Rome to act before thinking. Hannibal understood this psychology. An invasion from the north did more than bypass defenses. It attacked Roman confidence. It suggested vulnerability where doctrine insisted none existed. But this only worked if the shock arrived early, before Rome adjusted. Delay would neutralize surprise. Adaptation would follow. Which leads to the central compression of the strategic map. Rome needed time. Hannibal needed immediacy. Rome could recover from defeat. Hannibal could not recover from irrelevance. The narrowing of options. From this position, Hannibal's menu of strategies shrank rapidly. A cautious approach meant stalemate and eventual defeat. A defensive posture meant being crushed by Roman depth. A conventional invasion meant meeting prepared legions on expected ground. Only one path offered asymmetry. A move so extreme that Rome would not prepare for it. A move that attacked not territory, but perception. A move that accepted catastrophic risk in exchange for strategic acceleration. This was not brilliance born of freedom. It was creativity under constraint. Hannibal did not choose the Alps because they were optimal. He chose them because everything else led to slow death. And yet, even at this stage, the idea was still insane. Which raises the next question. If this was such a terrible idea, why did the correct alternatives fail even faster? Because the rules Hannibal was breaking were designed for wars he could not afford to fight. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It encodes accumulated experience into patterns that feel safe, repeatable, and rational. In the ancient world, this doctrine was not written in manuals, but it was deeply understood by every competent commander. Protect your supply lines, fight near friendly populations, avoid terrain that exhausts your army before it meets the enemy, and never place yourself where retreat becomes impossible. By those standards, Hannibal's decision violated almost every rule that mattered. A normal Carthaginian strategy against Rome would have followed one of three paths. The first was maritime pressure, contest Roman naval dominance, threaten coastal holdings, and keep the war peripheral. The second was Iberian containment, bleed Roman forces in Spain, where Carthage had infrastructure and political leverage. The third was indirect attrition, force Rome to fight in multiple theaters, stretching manpower and finances over time. All three approaches shared one assumption, that time could be managed. But time was the one variable Hannibal could not control. Doctrine assumed that both sides benefited from delay in roughly comparable ways. This war did not fit that model. Every additional campaigning season amplified Rome's advantages and eroded Carthage's political patience. What Doctrine framed as prudence functioned here as a slow-motion surrender. If Hannibal fought conventionally, Rome would lose battles and learn from them. Rome had done this before. Defeats were processed, not internalized as existential trauma. The Senate replaced commanders. New legions were raised. Alliances held. From a doctrinal standpoint, Rome was not fragile. It was resilient. This is the paradox Hannibal faced: the safer the strategy looked, the more it favored his enemy. Consider the most obvious alternative, an invasion through southern Italy via the coast or Sicily. This route preserved supply lines and allowed naval support. It was also precisely where Rome expected pressure. Roman fleets dominated those waters. Roman garrisons were already positioned. A campaign there would devolve into siege, maneuver, and attrition, the kind Rome excelled at. A second alternative was consolidation in Iberia. There, Hannibal could fight Rome on favorable terms, supported by established logistics and local allies. But Iberia was strategically peripheral. Even decisive victories there would not force Rome to negotiate. Rome could afford to lose distant provinces while building strength elsewhere. The doctrinal mistake is subtle but fatal. Doctrine evaluates success in military terms, not systemic ones. It asks how to win battles efficiently, not how to end wars against political machines. Hannibal did not need battlefield efficiency. He needed systemic rupture. That meant forcing Rome into a psychological and political crisis before its adaptive capacity activated. Doctrine offered no solution for that. In fact, doctrine actively discouraged it. Crossing the Alps did not just break tactical rules. It broke a deeper assumption, that wars progress through manageable phases. Preparation. Engagement. Consolidation. Negotiation. Hannibal was attempting to skip phases entirely. He was trying to inject Rome directly into crisis. This explains why most commanders would never choose this path. Not because they lacked courage, but because the decision violated the mental model through which commanders interpret risk. Doctrine frames risk as something to be minimized. Hannibal reframed risk as something to be concentrated. The Alpine crossing bundled multiple dangers into a single irreversible movement: terrain exhaustion, logistical collapse, internal mutiny, and exposure to annihilation upon arrival. No contingency plan could fully mitigate these. Once committed, there was no controlled fallback. From a doctrinal perspective, this is irrational. From Hannibal's perspective, it was the only way to force the war onto a timeline Rome did not choose. And yet, doctrine was not entirely wrong. Every warning it implied eventually manifested. The army that emerged in Italy was smaller, exhausted, and dependent on local dynamics Hannibal could not fully command. Every subsequent operation was shaped by the original violation of logistical orthodoxy. Doctrine predicted these consequences accurately. What it failed to predict was how doctrine itself would shape Rome's response. Roman planners, steeped in their own assumptions, interpreted the Alpine crossing as aberration, not precedent. They did not redesign their strategic posture immediately. They reacted. They assumed the enemy had already paid the maximum cost for his audacity. They expected collapse to follow. That expectation was wrong. But it delayed adaptation. And delay was precisely what Hannibal needed. This is the key tension of the episode. Doctrine was right about the dangers. Hannibal was right about the opportunity. The crossing worked not because doctrine was foolish, but because doctrine shaped expectation so strongly that its violation produced shock. Shock bought time. Shock bought initiative. Shock forced Rome to fight on terms it did not select. But doctrine also exacted its price later, when shock faded, and systems reasserted themselves. At this stage, the strategy still existed only as an idea. An idea so extreme that even its architect could not fully control its consequences. The real question is not whether doctrine was wrong. The real question is why Hannibal was willing to abandon it anyway, and what assumptions allowed him to believe the gamble could succeed. Because the moment doctrine is discarded, everything rests on a handful of fragile beliefs. By the time the Alpine option solidified, Hannibal was no longer choosing between good and bad strategies. He was choosing between manageable failure and unmanageable risk. This distinction matters. There is little evidence that the Alpine crossing emerged as a universally supported plan within the Carthaginian system. It did not resemble a consensus strategy approved by a distant political body. It looked far more like a field commander's solution to a problem the state itself could not solve. Hannibal was operating at the edge of institutional tolerance. Carthage's political leadership was cautious, commercially oriented, and deeply divided. Its war aims were limited by internal rivalry and fear of overextension. What Hannibal proposed, implicitly, if not explicitly, was a strategy that would force Carthage to commit, whether it wanted to or not. This alone explains the resistance. The Alpine plan did not just endanger an army. It endangered the state's ability to control the war. Once Hannibal crossed into Italy, Carthage would have only two options: escalate to support him, or abandon him and accept strategic humiliation. There would be no middle ground. This is why the decision was not simply bold. It was coercive. Internally, the logic was unstable. Any commander assessing the plan would have seen the same fault lines: extreme attrition before contact, unpredictable tribal resistance, climatic exposure, and the near certainty that the army arriving in Italy would be numerically inferior to Roman forces. The objections were obvious. So why did they not stop the plan? Because Hannibal was not solving a military problem. He was solving a strategic impossibility. He understood that Rome's strength was not in any single legion, but in its ability to reset. Lose one battle, fight another. Lose 1 year, prepare for the next. No single defeat, no matter how humiliating, forced Rome to concede. Unless that defeat occurred under conditions Rome believed impossible. The Alpine crossing was not designed to defeat Rome militarily in the first instance. It was designed to invalidate Rome's sense of strategic control. This leads to the first core assumption behind the decision. Hannibal believed that Roman power depended on predictability, on the belief that threats would emerge where doctrine said they should. By appearing where no threat was expected, he aimed to compress Rome's decision cycle before its institutions could stabilize. This assumption was fragile. It relied on psychology more than force. The second assumption followed naturally, that Rome's alliance system would interpret shock as vulnerability. That repeated Roman defeats on Italian soil would not be absorbed as temporary reversals, but as evidence of systemic failure. This was not irrational. Alliance loyalty in the ancient world was transactional and fear-based. If Rome could not protect its allies, its authority could evaporate quickly. But this assumption contained a hidden risk. It treated allies as passive observers rather than rational actors with long-term incentives. It underestimated the deterrent effect of Rome's reputation for punishment. The third assumption was the most dangerous of all: that time, once accelerated, could not be slowed again. Hannibal believed that if he forced Rome into crisis early, the war would unfold on compressed timelines that favored him. He assumed Rome would be compelled to seek decisive battle, to overreact, to fracture internally. This assumption proved partially correct, and ultimately incomplete. What is often missed in popular retellings is that none of these assumptions were certainties, even to Hannibal. This was not confidence masquerading as genius. It was controlled desperation. Hannibal did not know the Alps could be crossed at acceptable cost. He did not know which tribes would resist or cooperate. He did not know how Rome would recalibrate after the initial shock. What he knew was that the alternatives were strategically sterile. This is where the decision becomes unorthodox in its deepest sense. Most commanders seek strategies that preserve optionality. Hannibal selected one that destroyed it. Once the army committed to the mountains, there was no partial execution. No pause. No diplomatic probe. No safe retreat. The plan converted uncertainty into inevitability. Either the army emerged in Italy with enough cohesion to fight, or the campaign ended without a battle. This was not recklessness. It was a recognition that gradualism favored the wrong side. At a structural level, Hannibal was attacking Rome's reaction time. Roman command systems were deliberative, political, and rotational. Consuls changed annually. Decisions required Senate approval. Strategy was subject to public expectation and institutional inertia. An unexpected invasion from the north forced these systems to operate under stress. Rapid mobilization. Emergency deployments. Commanders pushed into action before they fully understood the situation. The Alpine crossing was therefore an attack on process, not position. This is also why the decision created internal unease even among Hannibal's supporters. It subordinated tactical prudence to strategic shock. It wagered the entire war on the hope that Rome would misinterpret what was happening. Had Rome immediately reframed the invasion as a long-term containment problem, the gamble would have failed faster than it eventually did. But Rome did not do that, at least not at first. This does not make Hannibal prophetic. It makes him temporally accurate. He correctly predicted Rome's initial response window. He did not control Rome's long-term adaptation. That distinction is crucial. The unorthodox nature of the decision lies not in the geography of the Alps, but in the logic beneath it, the deliberate choice to trade endurance for acceleration, stability for shock, and safety for narrative dominance. Hannibal was not asking, "Can this work?" He was asking, "Can anything else end the war?" Once framed that way, the irrational began to look necessary. But necessity does not neutralize consequence. The moment the army began its ascent, the strategy stopped being theoretical. Every assumption now had to survive contact with reality, terrain, weather, fear, hunger, and exhaustion. And this is where the plan came closest to collapsing before it ever reached Rome's site. Because the most dangerous phase of the strategy was not the battle that followed, it was the execution that almost erased the army before Rome even understood what was happening. By the time the Alpine option hardened into a real plan, Hannibal Barca was no longer choosing between good and bad strategies. He was choosing between a failure that would arrive slowly and predictably, and a risk so concentrated that it could end the war quickly, or end his army before Rome even understood what was happening. That distinction matters. It reframes the crossing as something colder than audacity. It becomes a decision made under structural constraint, where the conventional path is not merely inferior, but terminal. The Alpine plan did not resemble an elegant consensus forged calmly inside a stable state apparatus. Carthage was wealthy, commercially oriented, and politically divided. Its governing class was not designed for long, expensive wars of national endurance. It could finance campaigns, but it struggled to sustain strategic unity when outcomes were uncertain and timelines stretched. Hannibal's move, therefore, was not only a military gamble. It was a political one, because it effectively forced Carthage into commitment after the fact. Once an army is deep in Italy, the state has fewer options. Support becomes escalation. Abandonment becomes humiliation. In that sense, the crossing was coercive even toward Hannibal's own side. It pushed his homeland into a narrower strategic corridor. Any competent commander of the era could have listed the objections. The Alps were not simply hard terrain. They were a supply vacuum, a cohesion killer, and a multiplier of internal fracture. An army crossing them would pay an attrition tax before it ever met a Roman legion. It would arrive tired, hungry, and smaller. It would also arrive with no reliable line back to a secure base, meaning that a setback in the first encounters could produce not a retreat, but a collapse. These are the kinds of risks doctrine exists to avoid, and they were obvious even without modern data. So the question is not why critics existed. The question is why those critics did not stop the plan. They did not stop it because Hannibal was trying to solve a problem that conventional military logic could not solve. Rome's strength was not in a particular army, but in its capacity to regenerate. Rome could lose a field force, replace a commander, raise new legions, and continue the war. Many ancient states were knocked out by one catastrophe because their political cohesion snapped. Rome had a different behavior. It metabolized defeat. That meant a normal campaign, even a competent one, risked being strategically sterile. It might win battles without changing the war's trajectory. Hannibal needed more than victory. He needed disruption. This is where the first core assumption emerges, and it is more psychological than tactical. Hannibal believed Roman power depended, in part, on the belief that threats would appear where doctrine said they should. Rome did not ignore the Alps because it was stupid. It dismissed them because it was rational inside its own model. An enemy army could not cross them at scale without paying a price that would neutralize its operational value. Hannibal's plan attacked that belief directly. If he could appear in Italy from the impossible direction, he would not just bypass defenses. He would compress Rome's decision-making time and force Roman institutions to react under stress before they could build a coherent strategic response. The crossing, in other words, was not merely a rout. It was an assault on Rome's confidence in its own strategic map. The second assumption was political, and it targeted Rome's true center of gravity, the alliance network that made Rome more than a city. Hannibal's campaign was designed to demonstrate that Rome could not protect its partners. The message would not be delivered through speeches. It would be delivered through repeated Roman defeats on Italian soil, under conditions Rome had promised would never exist. If the Allies began to doubt Roman protection, the system could fracture from within. But this assumption hid a risk that is easy to miss when the story is told like a legend. Allies are not simply frightened spectators. They calculate. They remember Rome's punishments. They weigh short-term fear against long-term survival. Hannibal was betting that shock and humiliation would outweigh the deterrent effect of Rome's reputation. That bet was not automatically correct, even if the first battles went his way. The third assumption was the most dangerous because it was about time, and time in war behaves differently than commanders wish. Hannibal's logic demanded acceleration. He needed Rome to feel the war as immediate and existential, and he needed that feeling to translate into rash decisions. Roman culture, politics, and command rotation created pressure for action. A sudden invasion would generate demands for decisive battle, for quick restoration of honor, for visible results. Hannibal was wagering that Rome could be forced to fight before it stabilized, and that early instability would cascade. But embedded in this was a brittle premise, that once Rome was pushed into crisis mode, it could not shift into a more patient, systemic response. Hannibal was not merely planning to win. He was planning to keep Rome inside a psychological trap long enough for the alliance network to crack. None of these assumptions were certainties, and the most interesting point is that the plan did not require Hannibal to be sure. It required him to believe that the alternative, slow, doctrinal, manageable warfare, was strategically dead on arrival. This is the cold logic that popular retellings often avoid. The crossing is remembered as a feat but as a decision, it is closer to controlled desperation. Hannibal did not possess modern intelligence about weather windows or detailed topography. He did not control the behavior of mountain tribes. He could not guarantee that the army would maintain cohesion under starvation and fear. He could only identify that the Roman system rewarded patience, and therefore the only way to compete was to deny Rome the comfort of time. This is why the decision was unorthodox at the deepest level. Most commanders aim to preserve optionality. They keep retreat routes, supply corridors, and strategic flexibility. Hannibal did the opposite. He intentionally destroyed his own optionality to force strategic acceleration. Once committed to the mountains, there would be no partial execution. No pause to renegotiate. No safe withdrawal if conditions changed. The plan converted uncertainty into inevitability. Either the army emerged in Italy sufficiently coherent to fight, or the campaign ended without Rome needing to win a battle. That is not how most wars are planned, because it is not how most states can tolerate risk. The crossing also functioned as an attack on Roman process, not simply Roman positions. Roman decision-making was political, deliberative, and structurally slow to pivot. Consuls were elected. Authority was distributed. Strategy had to survive institutional debate. Under normal circumstances, that system created resilience. Under sudden shock, it could produce lag, confusion, and overreaction, especially when public expectation demanded immediate action. Hannibal was not betting on a single Roman commander's incompetence. He was betting on systemic stress. He wanted Rome to move fast, and therefore imperfectly. That bet would buy him an initial window. But a window is not a victory condition. Even if the shock worked, even if Rome stumbled, the plan still carried a built-in problem. Once shock fades, the system returns. Hannibal could predict the first response. He could not fully control the long-term adaptation. This is the hinge the entire documentary must sit on. The crossing was brilliant as an act of strategic acceleration, but acceleration is not the same thing as closure. A war can be sped up without being ended. And when that happens, the side that sacrificed endurance to gain speed may discover it has purchased momentum it cannot sustain. The moment Hannibal began the ascent, strategy stopped being theory. It became logistics, fear, hunger, cold, exhaustion, and discipline under pressure, conditions where a coalition army can disintegrate faster than it can march. And that is the part most stories soften, because it threatens the romance of the feat, but in reality, the most dangerous phase was not the battle that followed. It was the execution that could erase the campaign before Rome even recognized it as a threat. Because the crossing was not a road into Italy, it was a filter designed to kill armies, and Hannibal chose to walk into it anyway. Execution is where unorthodox strategies are exposed. On paper, risk can be framed, bounded, and justified. On the ground, it becomes hunger, fear, fatigue, and the slow erosion of discipline. Hannibal's Alpine strategy lived or died in this transition. The moment the army left the last secure lowlands, the campaign entered a phase where no operational brilliance could compensate for systemic failure. This was not maneuver warfare. It was a test of whether a coalition force could survive sustained stress without the psychological relief of contact with the enemy. The first problem was not Rome. It was momentum. Large armies move on rhythm. When that rhythm breaks, when columns stall, when units lose sight of one another, when delays compound, cohesion begins to unravel. The Alps did not simply slow Hannibal's force, they fractured it. Narrow passes forced the army into extended columns vulnerable to harassment and accident. Weather punished predictability. Cold numbed hands and judgment. Animals slipped. Equipment was lost. None of this was dramatic in isolation. Together, it created a grinding attrition that no battlefield victory could quickly repay. Logistics, already fragile by design, became improvisational. The campaign could not rely on fixed supply depots. It depended on local acquisition, negotiation, intimidation, and occasional plunder. This mode of sustenance carried its own risks. It antagonized populations whose cooperation might later be needed. It forced tactical dispersion to gather food, increasing vulnerability. It also shifted the army's moral center. Survival imperatives begin to override command intent. Discipline holds only as long as soldiers believe the ordeal leads somewhere meaningful. This is where the strategy flirted with self-destruction. A multinational force under extreme deprivation does not fail all at once. It sheds capability in layers. First, stragglers. Then animals. Then non-essential equipment. Eventually, trust. Hannibal's army contained units with different languages, customs, and reasons for fighting. Under normal conditions, these differences can be managed by pay, leadership, and shared success. In the mountains, those tools weakened. Pay mattered less than warmth. Promises mattered less than food. Authority narrowed to the immediate chain of command, and even that was strained by exhaustion. The Alpine crossing also introduced a silent enemy, time without feedback. In most campaigns, movement is punctuated by contact. Engagement validates purpose. Even defeat clarifies direction. In the Alps, days passed without confirmation that the strategy was working. No Roman banners appeared. No cities fell. There was only ascent, loss, and the knowledge that turning back would be worse than continuing. This psychological void is lethal to morale. Soldiers endure hardship more readily when they understand its function. Here, function was abstract. Italy existed somewhere beyond the ridgelines, but the cost was immediate and visible. At least twice, the plan approached the edge of collapse. One danger was tribal resistance in the passes, where ambush could exploit terrain to devastating effect. These were not pitched battles, but they did not need to be. A rockslide, a blocked path, a sudden panic could freeze movement and cascade into chaos. Another danger was weather-induced paralysis. A single early snowfall could immobilize men and animals long enough to break the campaign. In both cases, the margin for error was thin. Hannibal's ability to manage these crises relied less on tactics than on maintaining forward motion at any cost. Stopping was more dangerous than advancing. This reveals a critical feature of the execution. Once underway, the strategy became self-propelling. It could not be paused for reassessment. Every delay magnified risk. Every setback reduced options. The campaign had crossed from planning into what might be called irreversible exposure. This is why traditional doctrine avoids such situations. Not because commanders lack courage, but because systems prefer reversibility. Hannibal rejected that preference. He accepted that survival itself would become the measure of success until the army reached Italy. The emergence into the Italian plains did not resolve these problems. It transformed them. The army that descended from the Alps was alive, but diminished. It carried psychological capital, shock, audacity, the aura of the impossible, but it also carried structural weakness. It had no secure base. Its supply remained contingent. Its numbers were reduced. Every subsequent decision had to account for the fact that the army could not absorb heavy losses and recover. Victory became necessary not just for strategy, but for sustenance. This is where the execution begins to intersect with the next phase of the plan. Hannibal needed engagement, but not just any engagement. He needed Roman reactions that would validate the risk he had taken. A cautious Roman response, containment, avoidance, harassment, would have been disastrous. It would have denied Hannibal the psychological dividends of the crossing and exposed the logistical hollowness of his position. In that sense, the Alpine gamble did not end at the foothills. It extended into a dependency on Roman behavior. The risk here is often understated. Hannibal's plan required Rome to cooperate by making mistakes. Not foolish mistakes, but predictable ones rooted in institutional culture. Rome needed to rush. Rome needed to seek decisive battle. Rome needed to interpret the invasion as an affront that demanded immediate correction. If Rome instead reframed the war as one of isolation and exhaustion, the Alpine crossing would be remembered not as brilliance, but as folly. During execution, Hannibal worked to shape this response. He moved aggressively. He demonstrated presence. He sought engagements that reinforced the narrative of Roman vulnerability. These actions were not merely tactical. They were communicative. They signaled confidence and inevitability. But signaling does not erase material limits. Each engagement carried risk. Each loss reduced the already thin margin. There is a tendency in popular accounts to treat the crossing as a discrete episode, a prelude to the real war. Strategically, this is misleading. The crossing defined the entire campaign's character. It locked Hannibal into a posture of constant forward pressure. He could not retreat to regroup. He could not disengage for long periods. His army was too fragile for inactivity and too exposed for caution. The strategy demanded continuous motion and continuous pressure, even when prudence might have suggested consolidation. This created a paradox. The very audacity that gave Hannibal initiative also denied him rest. Momentum became a requirement, not a choice. Any pause risked decay, loss of morale, loss of allies, loss of relevance. In this way, the execution phase converted strategic brilliance into operational compulsion. Hannibal had to keep winning, not because victory ended the war, but because stopping would end his army. Two micro-twists underline how close the plan came to failure. First, the simple fact that arrival did not equal readiness. The army that reached Italy needed time to recover, reorganize, and adapt to new terrain. But time was precisely what Hannibal could not afford. Second, the reliance on local dynamics introduced volatility. Cooperation from some groups was offset by hostility from others. Each negotiation carried uncertainty. Each misstep could close doors permanently. Execution, then, was not a triumphal march. It was a prolonged balancing act over an abyss. Hannibal's leadership mattered enormously here, but leadership alone cannot substitute for structure. Charisma does not feed men. Reputation does not replace supply. What kept the campaign alive was not a single heroic act, but the continuous avoidance of catastrophic failure. This is the uncomfortable truth of unorthodox strategy. Success often looks like survival rather than dominance. The Alps did not deliver Hannibal to Italy as a conqueror. They delivered him as a problem, dangerous, unpredictable, and difficult to eliminate, but also constrained and vulnerable. At this point, the strategy had achieved its first objective. Rome was confronted with an enemy it had not prepared for, in a place it had assumed was secure. The shock was real. But shock is perishable. Its value decays as soon as the opponent begins to understand it. The next phase would determine whether the Alpine crossing was a catalyst for systemic collapse, or merely an expensive way to start a war that Rome was still structurally favored to win. Because the gamble only mattered if Rome responded the way Hannibal needed it to, and not the way Rome was ultimately capable of responding. Rome did not fail to notice Hannibal. It failed to understand him in time. When news arrived that a Carthaginian army had crossed the Alps and descended into northern Italy, the shock was immediate and institutional. This was not simply an operational surprise. It was a cognitive rupture. Roman strategic culture had categorized threats by geography and probability, and the Alps sat firmly outside the realm of plausible invasion routes. The response, therefore, was not the execution of a prepared plan, but a scramble to restore coherence under pressure. Rome reacted quickly. What it did not do, at least initially, was react strategically. The first Roman instinct was to reassert control through confrontation. This impulse was deeply embedded in Roman political and military norms. Roman legitimacy rested on visible action. Delay could be interpreted as weakness. Avoidance could look like fear. Consuls were expected to fight, not to wait. In this environment, an enemy appearing where he should not exist was not merely a military problem. It was a challenge to Rome's authority and self-image. That challenge demanded a response that could be seen and understood by allies and citizens alike. This is where Hannibal's strategy intersected perfectly with Roman culture. The Alpine crossing was designed to provoke urgency, and Rome delivered it. Instead of reframing the war as one of containment, isolation, and attrition, strategies that would have exploited Hannibal's logistical fragility, Rome initially sought engagement. It treated the invasion as an abnormal crisis requiring immediate correction rather than a systemic threat requiring patience. In doing so, Rome shortened its own decision cycle. Roman commanders interpreted the signals they received through familiar lenses. They saw an enemy army that had suffered enormous losses crossing hostile terrain. They assumed exhaustion, low morale, and operational weakness. From a doctrinal standpoint, this assessment was reasonable. An army that emerges from such an ordeal should be vulnerable. What Roman command underestimated was the psychological capital Hannibal had purchased with that suffering. The crossing did not just weaken his force. It hardened it, clarified its purpose, and bound its survival to continued aggression. This misreading led to the first strategic error, underestimating the asymmetry of stakes. Rome could afford a setback. Hannibal could not. That difference meant Hannibal would accept risks Rome would not expect. He would fight aggressively, because delay favored his enemy. Roman commanders, assuming a conventional calculus of risk, did not fully account for how far Hannibal was willing to push engagements to maintain momentum and legitimacy. A second error followed from Rome's institutional structure. Roman command was rotational and politically exposed. Consuls held authority for limited terms. Success brought honor, failure brought scrutiny. In such a system, caution carries personal cost. Aggression offers the possibility of decisive credit. This dynamic nudged Roman commanders toward battle even when strategic logic might have suggested restraint. Hannibal did not need Roman leaders to be foolish. He needed them to be human inside their system. At the Senate level, the invasion triggered competing pressures. On one hand, Rome's political elite understood the value of endurance. On the other, they faced public fear and allied uncertainty. Allowing a foreign army to roam Italy unchallenged risked eroding confidence in Rome's protective capacity. Every delay sent a signal. Hannibal's presence itself became a form of pressure, independent of what his army actually did. This created a critical window. Rome moved forces north, committed legions, and sought to re-establish the narrative of control. These reactions were not irrational. They were consistent with Roman precedent. The problem was that precedent had been built against enemies who fought within Rome's conceptual map. Hannibal was forcing Rome to operate outside that map. Another misinterpretation lay in Rome's initial framing of the invasion as a localized threat rather than a systemic one. Roman command focused on defeating Hannibal's army, not on neutralizing the strategic effects of his presence. This distinction matters. A localized threat can be met with force. A systemic threat requires adaptation. Rome's early moves prioritized the former. Hannibal benefited from the delay in recognizing the latter. There was also a subtle information problem. News traveled slowly and unevenly. Reports from the north were fragmented, colored by fear or exaggeration. Roman leaders had to make decisions based on incomplete signals. In such conditions, familiar doctrines feel safer than abstract innovation. This reinforced the tendency to seek battle and resolution rather than to experiment with avoidance and pressure. Hannibal exploited this phase not by deception in the narrow sense, but by consistency. He behaved exactly as a commander with no alternatives would behave, assertively, visibly, and without hesitation. Every movement reinforced the impression of confidence. Every engagement suggested inevitability. Rome, interpreting these signals through its own assumptions, concluded that confrontation was necessary and overdue. It is important to stress what Rome did not yet do. It did not immediately shift to a strategy of denial, cutting off Hannibal's access to supplies, avoiding decisive engagement, and using superior manpower to shadow and exhaust him. That approach would later emerge. But it required a conceptual shift, the acceptance that not fighting could be the fastest way to win. Early in the campaign, that idea had little political traction. This delay does not imply Roman incompetence. It reflects the cost of institutional inertia. Large systems adapt slowly, especially under public scrutiny. Hannibal's crossing forced Rome to act before adaptation could mature. That was the entire point of the gamble. However, the same system that produced early missteps also contained the seeds of correction. Rome's ability to absorb failure, analyze it, and change behavior was real. Once the initial shock subsided, Roman leadership began to ask different questions. Not how to defeat Hannibal in a single blow, but how to render his presence irrelevant over time. This transition marks the inflection point of the war. Hannibal succeeded in forcing Rome into early confrontation and in exploiting Roman overconfidence and urgency. He did not succeed in freezing Rome inside that reactive posture indefinitely. The system learned. Slowly, but decisively. In retrospect, Rome's wrong reactions were not errors of ignorance. They were errors of timing. Rome behaved as it always had, too quickly for Hannibal's long-term interests, but not too slowly for its own survival. The Alpine crossing bought Hannibal time and initiative. It did not permanently rewrite Roman strategy. And that is the central tension of this phase. Hannibal needed Roman misinterpretation to persist. Rome needed only to correct once. The moment Rome began to see Hannibal not as a crisis to be resolved, but as a problem to be managed, the balance shifted. The shock value of the Alps faded. The structural advantages Rome had deferred began to reassert themselves. The gamble had worked. But it was already expiring. Because unorthodox strategies win their advantage in the reaction phase, and lose at the moment the opponent learns how to wait. By any narrow military measure, Hannibal's campaign in Italy delivered results that should have been decisive. Roman armies were defeated repeatedly. Roman commanders were outmaneuvered. Roman confidence was shaken in ways few enemies had ever achieved. And yet, when the dust settled, Rome still stood. The war continued. And Carthage, not Rome, moved closer to exhaustion. This contradiction is not an accident of history. It is the consequence of the strategy itself. The immediate outcome of the Alpine gamble was success in the dimension it targeted: shock. Rome was forced into battles it did not want, at times and places it did not fully control. Hannibal proved that Roman legions could be beaten decisively on Italian soil. This alone was unprecedented. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility and sent a clear signal to Rome's allies that the protective shield they relied on was not absolute. But strategic success is not measured only by what collapses. It is measured by what replaces it. Rome did not collapse. It adapted. The first cost of Hannibal's strategy was numerical and irreversible. The army that entered Italy was never restored to its original strength. Losses suffered during the crossing could not be replaced easily. Reinforcements from Carthage were limited, politically contested, and logistically complex. Every battle, even victorious ones, reduced a force that could not regenerate at the pace of its enemy. Hannibal was winning fights with an army that was slowly disappearing. This attrition created a paradox. Each victory increased Hannibal's reputation but decreased his material capacity to exploit it. The campaign became trapped in a loop where success was necessary to survive, but survival made decisive success harder. The strategy had front-loaded risk and reward. Over time, the balance inverted. The second cost was logistical. Hannibal's army remained dependent on local dynamics for sustenance. That dependency limited strategic freedom. Operations had to align with regions that could support the force, which constrained movement and reduced unpredictability. Rome, learning from early encounters, began to deny resources rather than contest ground. As Roman commanders shifted toward containment and exhaustion, Hannibal's freedom of action narrowed. This was not a single turning point. It was a slow constriction. The war did not swing suddenly against Hannibal. It tightened around him. The political cost was equally severe. Hannibal's strategy assumed that repeated Roman defeats would fracture the alliance system. This happened partially, but not at the scale required to end the war. Some allies defected. Many did not. Rome's reputation for eventual retribution proved stronger than Hannibal anticipated. Allies calculated not only present fear, but future survival. Rome could punish betrayal decades later. Hannibal could not guarantee long-term protection. Meanwhile, Carthage itself paid a political price. The longer the war dragged on without resolution, the more divided Carthaginian leadership became. Support for Hannibal was real, but conditional. Resources were finite. Other theaters demanded attention. The state that Hannibal had tried to force into commitment through audacity began to hesitate, precisely because the war had not ended quickly. This exposed the deepest vulnerability of the strategy: it lacked a reliable mechanism for closure. Hannibal could win battles. He could terrorize Roman territory. He could disrupt alliances at the margins. What he could not do was compel Rome to negotiate on unfavorable terms. Rome's political system did not translate battlefield defeat into surrender. It translated it into mobilization. The very quality Hannibal had tried to overwhelm with shock proved resilient under sustained pressure. The psychological cost to Hannibal himself should not be underestimated. He had wagered everything on acceleration. When acceleration failed to produce collapse, he was left managing a war he had explicitly designed to avoid. Each year that passed eroded the logic of the original gamble. Yet retreat was impossible. Withdrawal would have turned audacity into failure. Staying meant accepting a slow strategic bleed. From Rome's perspective, the cost was immense but tolerable. Losses were staggering. Entire armies were destroyed. Yet the system absorbed them. Roman society recalibrated its expectations. Commanders were chosen differently. Strategy shifted toward denial rather than confrontation. The shock faded, replaced by grim determination. In this phase, the Alpine crossing began to look different. What had once been a strategic masterstroke became a structural constraint. Hannibal was locked into Italy with diminishing leverage. Rome was locked into a war it now understood how to manage. This does not retroactively invalidate the strategy. It clarifies its limits. The Alpine gamble succeeded at what it was designed to do: disrupt, accelerate, destabilize. It failed at what it could not guarantee: forcing a political outcome from military shock alone. That failure does not stem from poor execution or lack of courage. It stems from a mismatch between the strategy's temporal logic and Rome's capacity for endurance. If the gamble had failed earlier, if the army had collapsed in the mountains, if Rome had immediately adopted containment, the strategy would be remembered as folly. If Rome's alliance network had fractured more deeply, if Carthage had committed more decisively, it might be remembered as decisive genius. History delivered neither extreme. It delivered a prolonged war that consumed the advantages Hannibal had purchased at extraordinary cost. This ambiguity is the real outcome. Hannibal did not lose because he was tactically inferior. He lost because the strategy he chose made time his enemy in a war against a state built to survive time. And that leads to the final question the documentary must answer. What, exactly, does this strategy teach us, if its brilliance and its failure are inseparable? Because the value of an unorthodox strategy lies not in whether it wins, but in what it reveals about the systems it confronts, and the limits of shock itself. When stripped of legend and geography, Hannibal's Alpine campaign was not fundamentally about mountains, weather, or even battlefield tactics. It was about time. More precisely, it was about who controlled the tempo of the war, and what happened when tempo became a weapon rather than a byproduct. At its core, the strategy attempted to solve a problem that conventional military thinking often avoids: how to defeat an opponent whose strength lies not in winning, but in surviving. Rome did not need brilliance to prevail. It needed continuity. Its system converted loss into learning, fear into mobilization, and pressure into cohesion. Hannibal recognized this early. He understood that fighting Rome well was not enough. He needed to fight Rome differently, in a way that denied the system its preferred mode of operation. The Alpine crossing was that denial mechanism. By violating assumptions about geography and feasibility, Hannibal forced Rome into a compressed decision environment. Shock was not an emotional side effect. It was the strategic payload. The goal was not simply to appear in Italy, but to appear there too early, before Rome could align its political, military, and psychological processes into a coherent response. This reframes the campaign's meaning. Hannibal was not attempting to outfight Rome in a prolonged contest of strength. He was attempting to outpace Rome before strength mattered. That distinction is critical. It explains why the strategy accepted levels of attrition that would normally be disqualifying. Attrition was tolerated because delay was fatal. The first rule this campaign breaks is the assumption that risk should be minimized. Hannibal concentrated risk instead. He bundled multiple uncertainties, terrain, supply, morale, alliance behavior, into a single, irreversible move. In doing so, he turned uncertainty into pressure, both on himself and on Rome. This is deeply counterintuitive. Most military systems are designed to distribute risk across time and space. Hannibal collapsed it into one moment. The second rule it breaks is the belief that military success naturally produces political outcomes. Hannibal demonstrated the limits of that belief. He won battles that would have ended wars against many states. Rome was not one of them. The campaign exposes a structural truth: political systems with high endurance thresholds can absorb military humiliation without conceding strategically. Shock can destabilize such systems, but it cannot replace the need for mechanisms of closure. This is where the strategy ultimately faltered. Hannibal had a theory of disruption, but not a reliable theory of resolution. He assumed that accelerated crisis would force Rome into errors it could not recover from. He underestimated Rome's capacity to reframe the conflict once the initial shock passed. Rome learned how to wait. Once it did, the strategic value of the Alpine crossing decayed rapidly. The third rule challenged here concerns logistics. Doctrine treats logistics as a foundation, something to be secured before decisive action. Hannibal inverted this logic. He treated logistics as a variable to be improvised under pressure. This allowed speed and surprise, but it also imposed a ceiling on endurance. The campaign shows that logistical improvisation can enable strategic audacity, but only temporarily. Over time, structural supply advantages reassert themselves. From a modern perspective, this raises an uncomfortable lesson. Unorthodox strategies often succeed not because they are optimal, but because they exploit cognitive rigidity in opponents. They work best against systems that mistake improbability for impossibility. Once that rigidity is corrected, the advantage evaporates. Hannibal's strategy was devastating precisely once. After that, it became expensive. Another lesson lies in the distinction between operational brilliance and strategic sufficiency. Hannibal was operationally extraordinary. He maneuvered, fought, and survived against overwhelming odds. But operational success did not translate into strategic sufficiency because the war he forced was not the war Rome ultimately chose to fight. Rome shifted the frame. It moved from reaction to management. From confrontation to containment. When that happened, Hannibal's advantages became liabilities. This does not diminish the strategy's importance. On the contrary, it makes it more instructive. The Alpine campaign reveals the ceiling of shock-based strategies against resilient systems. Shock can open doors. It cannot guarantee what lies beyond them. There is also a cautionary lesson for states and commanders tempted by audacity. Extreme strategies tend to personalize success. They depend heavily on exceptional leadership, morale, and narrative momentum. When those elements degrade, as they inevitably do over time, the strategy loses coherence. Hannibal's campaign required him to remain exceptional every year. Rome needed only to become adequate. This asymmetry matters. Systems designed around endurance favor average performance sustained over time. Systems designed around disruption favor peaks that cannot be maintained indefinitely. Hannibal chose the latter because the former was unavailable to him. That choice was rational. It was also limiting. The final lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable. Hannibal's strategy failed not because it was wrong, but because it confronted a system it could not finish. The Alps did not defeat Hannibal. Rome's ability to absorb shock did. This suggests that the true measure of strategic success is not how dramatically a plan disrupts the enemy, but how well it anticipates the enemy's adaptation after disruption. In that sense, the Alpine crossing stands as both a warning and a blueprint. It warns against confusing audacity with inevitability. And it provides a blueprint for how unorthodox strategies emerge, not from creative excess, but from structural constraint. Hannibal did not choose risk because he loved danger. He chose it because safety led nowhere. This is why the campaign remains contested centuries later. It resists simple classification. It is neither pure genius nor simple folly. It is a case study in strategic acceleration against systemic endurance, and in the limits of that acceleration. The Alps were crossed. The shock was delivered. The battles were won. And yet the war did not end. That is the point. Because some strategies succeed exactly as designed, and still reveal that design itself was insufficient for the kind of enemy they faced. Hannibal's Alpine crossing endures not because it was successful, but because it was honest about the kind of war it was fighting. It acknowledged a reality most strategies try to avoid: some opponents cannot be defeated by fighting them correctly. Rome was not a puzzle to be solved by superior tactics. It was a system built to survive failure. Hannibal understood this, and he chose a strategy that tried to short-circuit endurance with shock. That choice worked, briefly, violently, and at extraordinary cost. The campaign proved that even the most rigid strategic assumptions can be broken, and that breaking them can produce real, measurable advantage. Rome was forced into reactions it did not plan for. Its confidence was shaken. Its armies were destroyed in ways previously thought impossible. The Alps were not just crossed, they were weaponized as an attack on Roman expectation. But the campaign also exposed a hard limit. Shock is a wasting asset. It decays the moment the opponent adapts. Once Rome learned how to wait, how to deny engagement, how to absorb fear without collapsing, the strategic logic of the crossing unraveled. Hannibal had designed a war that needed to end quickly. Rome redesigned it into a war that could last forever. This is the uncomfortable conclusion. Hannibal did not miscalculate Rome's weakness. He underestimated Rome's patience. He assumed that humiliation would force resolution. Rome proved that humiliation could be endured if survival was at stake. The Alpine gamble, then, was not a failure of courage or imagination. It was a collision between two incompatible strategic models. One relied on acceleration, concentration, and decisive rupture. The other relied on dispersion, adaptation, and time. The latter won not because it was elegant, but because it was durable. That is why this campaign still matters. It teaches that unorthodox strategies are often born from constraint, not creativity. They emerge when conventional options lead nowhere. They can change the shape of a war, but not always its outcome. And they demand a price that cannot be refunded when the moment passes. Hannibal crossed the Alps because standing still meant defeat. He was right. But crossing them did not guarantee victory, because some enemies are not defeated by being shocked, only by being exhausted.